Attention please. The last session of conference will start soon. Please take your seat. Good morning, everyone. I am Shim Young-jin, a Chief Director of Press Arbitration Commission. We are going to start the last session of the conference. We prepared the receivers for simultaneous interpretation. Button number 1 for Korean, number 2 for English. Now, I would like to introduce the moderator of the third session, Ms. An Chak-ki, the Director of Global Affairs Team of 중앙일보, which is a daily newspaper. She graduated from Yonsei University, majored in English literature, and was an anchorwoman of Arirang TV. From now, Ms. An Chak-ki will host session 3. Please welcome Ms. An with loud applause.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for turning up for this morning session on a very, very cold day. This is the coldest day so far this year. We're so happy to have you here, and I'm sure the talk that we're going to be hearing today from the two gentlemen to my left and my right will surely make things a little warmer in here. Now, this morning, as we just heard, this is the final session of this international conference. I think many of you were looking forward to this conference, this session. As you know, this session is on impending issues in the age of digital media. We ourselves at 중앙일보, we're grappling with this idea of trying to become a digital media, trying to move away from print and even moving away from television. If I may tell you a little bit about our group, the Chungang Media Group. It publishes newspapers, daily newspapers. We have weekly magazines, monthly magazines. We have a television station. We have a documentary channel. We basically are the biggest media group in Korea. But we are facing the biggest challenges because we are big. This digital age is posing huge challenges. How are we going to be going from print media to digital? How are we going to present ourselves on multiple platforms and so on? Now, today, we have two very distinguished speakers, and the topics today are very pertinent to the title of this session. As I'm sure you all know, Professor Yeom-gyu-ho, who is absolutely a celebrity, if I may say, in this field, will be talking about the right to be forgotten in the digital age. He's going to be talking about online practical obscurity as a global challenge. I think we see this in our daily lives. We've seen, for instance, we've seen negative reports about certain individuals that continue to circulate on the internet. That is just one example. I personally have seen an instance where a dear loved one, a friend, an acquaintance passes away, and their information continues to circulate on the internet. I don't know if that's good or bad, but we'll be exploring that issue further. And also, we will have another presentation on speed versus accuracy. Can we sacrifice any of these values? We will have Balazs Veer speaking about this as well. Now, I'm going to be introducing our speakers in a little bit more detail later on. But first of all, I think it's time now to hand over to the mic to Professor Yeom-gyu-ho. He is the Jonathan Marshall First Amendment Chair at the University of Oregon. He is an expert in communication law and media policy, and he is the editor of an extensive 12-volume book on the International Encyclopedia of Communication. So I think we are in absolutely good hands. We will hear from him for about 20 minutes, and after that, I will open the floor up to questions from the floor. We will have about 20 minutes for that, so please jot down your questions while we're listening to the professor's presentation. Professor? Yes, Professor will be giving his presentation from the podium. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Young with a big round of applause.
Good morning, everyone. Let me first say a couple of prefatory comments. I first want to say thank you to the Press Arbitration Commission, especially to Chairman Yong-Sung Park. Let me first say my personal footnote. I first came to know the Press Arbitration Commission in 1983. I came to Seoul as a first-year doctoral student from the United States. I was assigned to write a paper about freedom of the press and also responsibility of the press in 1983 as an independent 3-hour credit from my faculty advisor. And the first place I wanted to talk to the Press Arbitration Commission in 1983, already 31 years ago. My love affair with the Press Arbitration Commission has never stopped. I always owe the Press Arbitration Commission for my deep understanding and appreciation of the extraordinary development and the progress in the freedom of the press and the responsibility of the press in the past 31 years. That is my personal footnote. Second footnote is my extraordinary relationship with the Chairman Yong-Sung Park. I came to know him in the late 1980s as an American media law scholar. I am primarily teaching media law of the United States, but as a native of South Korea, I wanted to serve as a bridge between my native country, South Korea, and my adopted country, the United States. I always feel that Americans learn about their freedom of the press by talking to people outside the United States. In that context, I want to teach my American students, my American friends, my American lawyers about what is going on outside the United States. And I've enjoyed talking and writing about freedom of the press. In the past 25 years, Chairman Yong-Sung Park has helped me enormously as a thoughtful, caring resource person on South Korean law. Without his generous help, I don't think I am serving as a functional bridge between my native country, South Korea, and the rest of the world. And also, I'd like to say thank you to moderator An Cha-ki. And I came to know her when I first saw her on Arirang TV several years ago. And I was quite impressed with her. And I never expected to have her as the moderator of my session. Thank you so much. And more importantly, I'd like to say thank you to all of you, the audience. You are here to make me feel I am spending my time more productively than otherwise possible. And I hope, I am talking with you rather than talking to you. So be ready to ask me with all kinds of challenging and exciting questions about the right to be forgotten. Let me first start my presentation with one specific question. What is the significance of May 13th, 2014? Anybody? May 13th, exactly 6 months ago. I'm sorry? That's great. Google. May I have your name? Eric. Oh, yes, my friend from Israel. He already knows better than I do about the right to be forgotten, specifically the Google Spain case. The right to be forgotten was directly relating to the European Union. And the right to be forgotten in the digital age is a lot more controversial and a lot more vociferously debated in Europe, and of course, more importantly, outside the European Union. That's why the right to be forgotten in the digital age. Now, in the context of why the right to be forgotten, we have to know why the European Court of Justice, ECJ, recognized specifically the right to be forgotten in the internet era. We are talking about practical obscurity. Practical obscurity is not the word I have coined for this presentation. I am simply using the concept of a practical obscurity from the Supreme Court of the United States in 1989. The name of the case is the United States Department of Justice versus Reporters Committee on Freedom of the Press. In that particular case, the US Supreme Court said, if everyone has access to a computer and all the information about other people are available instantly or instantaneously through computer access, now everyone does not have the kind of privacy which they enjoyed before the computer age. Just a simple example has a lot to do with how information about you is now available. I don't know how many of you engage in a vanity search. Anybody knows a vanity search?
Self-Googling.
Yes, self-Googling. Why are so many people checking themselves through Googling? I do, to make sure what kind of things my students talk about me and my teaching. Yes. I also want to check my two sons' activities on Facebook and Twitter. That's what we are doing all the time. And that's what we talk about, practical obscurity as a global challenge. The 21st century is the global village. In the true sense of the word, global village. When you write an email, you should assume that it is available to everyone. That's what we are doing right now. So, the subtitle of my paper is Online Practical Obscurity as a Global Challenge. At the moment, as I said, a right to information as a matter of privacy is more important now than ever, largely because people have a lot more access to information about other people. The government agencies have access to information, almost everything. I am talking about the Snowden effect. I will talk about Snowden effect in a moment. And that is why, especially in Europe, they have a lot more serious concern about why informational privacy should be protected more rigorously than ever before. Information privacy essentially means you have a right of privacy to control what information you will share with the rest of the world, or what information you don't want to share with other people. Most importantly, whether you share information is no longer an issue. Rather, how you will share the information with other people, that is a more important issue. That is what we talk about, information privacy. Now, right to be forgotten is already, I said, relating to the so-called digital practical obscurity. I am using the US concept of digital practical obscurity as a frame of a comparative analysis. And finally, the most important question is how to balance information privacy in general and the right to be forgotten in particular with the freedom of expression. As you probably know, Article 19 of the Universal Declaration is guaranteeing the right to free speech and the right to a free press. I am talking about human right, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. European Convention on Human Rights, Article 10, guarantees the freedom of expression. Of course, Article 8 of European Convention on Human Rights recognizes privacy as a right. And of course, the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union is recognizing both right of privacy, and at the same time, freedom of expression. I am talking about Article 11. So very important way to look at. So that's why I am looking at three things. I hope, you did not waste too much of your time reading my 26, page paper. Instead, this is more or less sort of abbreviated version of my paper. So I am just focusing on three specific questions. What's the legal, conceptual, and the theoretical framework on the right for forgotten, essentially? And secondly, what's the evolution, or maybe revolution, of the right to be forgotten in the European Union? Finally, I'm looking at the impact of the right to be forgotten to freedom of expression, not necessarily in the European Union context, but importantly as a global issue. Theoretical and conceptual framework, I'd like to say a couple of comparative things. The reason why I mentioned the European American law, it has everything to do with the extraordinary impact of the First Amendment on the debate on freedom of expression as a human right. I always carry the U.S. Constitution, not necessarily as a U.S. citizen, but more importantly as a media law scholar. The United States has the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution is 4,440 words. Out of the 4,440 words, we are talking about the First Amendment of 45 words. Out of 45 First Amendment, we are talking about the 14 words. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Freedom of speech all of the press, but we have to look at the freedom of speech all of the press. Very important. Many people say, what's the relevance of freedom of speech or freedom of the press in American law to the rest of the world? Maybe not as relevant as it was 20 or 30 years ago. In the past 20 or 30 years, the influence of the European Union, EU law, has been extremely significant. So at least we have to look at the comparative approach between EU and the US. So basically, it is not really complicated things. Think about this. You are wanting to move on with your life. You want to improve your life. You want to rehabilitate yourself. But something you did wrong 10 or 20 years ago is popping all the time whenever you enjoy some kind of vanity searches, or other people are checking on you through Google. That is when how you can prove that you are better than what you were 20 or 30 years ago. And Google is spreading all the information which is sometimes inaccurate, sometimes irrelevant, sometimes outdated. That is when we talk about whether you can forgive and forget. I am talking about someone's mistakes, which were part of the growing process. When I was 20 or a teenager, I definitely made some mistakes. But the mistakes are not, I say, revealable to the rest of the world, but not anymore. I think your teenage sons or girls might already have shared the information. It will be there forever. That is where we talk about forgive and forget. Revisability principle. Revisability principle is an interesting concept developed by Professor Andrew Tutt, T-U-T-T. It will be published, sooner rather than later at the Yale Law School. It basically said, you can revise yourself to make your life more, I say better, instead of just anchoring your whole life to something that happened 20 or 30 years ago. So there is one way to look at. So that is how we can look at some kind of comparative approaches. Now, the significance of the right to be forgotten has everything to do with what has happened in the past almost 20 years. I am talking about the impact of the European Union Data Protection Directive. And at the moment, the European Union Data Protection Directive is being revised in one way or the other. So just 2 years ago, I think the European Commission has proposed revising and updating the EU Data Protection Directive. So look at this. I think there is a lot of other ways to look at, but at least when it comes to right to be forgotten ruling, we have to look at what kind of right of privacy, I see data protection is recognized and specifically required to be complied with by data processors and the data controllers. But look at the word, adequate, relevant, and not excessive. And not surprisingly, EU directive is less than precise, rather vague, rather lax. And so it means it creates all kind of a vagueness issue and overbreadth issue. I think that is something we have to think about. And also Article 12 of directive, I say data protection directive, specifically recognizes sort of access to information, more importantly, right to rectify. Rectify means correct. And the right to correct, as already I said, and also right to erase, and the right to block, and the right to objection. It has similar approaches to information in context with South Korean press arbitration law. So you can see some kind of similarities. But as I said, at the moment, European Commission is going to update and revise the data protection directive. They are now calling the revised directive data protection regulation. Regulation is totally different from directive. I am talking about sort of important. Directive is requiring 28 EU members to pass their own implementation law. But when it comes to the regulation, each and every 28 EU member nations doesn't have to pass their own local state law to implement the right to be forgotten law. So I think a very significant approach. So sort of EU-wide approach is now being proposed instead of case-by-case, state-by-state approach. So that is one way to look at. But at least the data protection regulation is still being debated, and it will, I say, look at the word, reinforced and modernized. Reinforced and modernized means already the right to be forgotten was part of the 1995 EU Data Protection Directive. So that is one way to look at. Now this case, and this case is quite complex and lengthy. I am talking about 100 paragraph opinion. Sometimes it is not read through the whole opinion, but I try to simplify, at the risk of a little bit too overly simplicity. But at least this is just a simple fact. Google Spain is in Spain. APD is the Spanish National Data Protection Agency. And the person who was directly involved in this case, Mario Costea Gonzalez. And he was a lawyer by training. But in 1998, because he did not pay some kind of tax or some kind of debt, his house was put on auction as part of the government proceedings. So, and the government published two specific announcements about the auction. The more people should be invited to participate in the auction, that is part of legal proceedings. And a major newspaper called La Vanguardia in Spain published stories, two stories in 1998. But for whatever reason, not surprisingly, like many other people, Mr. Costea Gonzalez searched himself through the Google. And when he searched his name through the Google, I think the stories published in 1998 popped up at the top of the page. That is when he was not really amused. And that is why he asked the newspaper and Google Spain and eventually Google Inc. to delete the information about him, arguing that the information is no longer relevant. It is a sort of a prejudice, already outdated. He paid everything. But why the stories are still popping up whenever somebody searched him through Google? that is the beginning of this interesting and landmark case. Interestingly, AEPD, the National Data Protection Agency, did not agree with Costea Gonzalez's argument that the Spanish newspaper deleted the original announcement published in 1998. But AEPD said Mr. Costea Gonzalez has a right to, delete the information which is coming out of the Google search about him. That is when Google challenged the AEPD order by asking a national Spanish court to rule on whether the AEPD government agency's order is correct. That is when the Spanish National Court asked European Court of Justice to interpret European Data Protection Directive. That is what we talk about here. Google challenged the order. Spanish court asked the ECJ to interpret the EU Data Protection Directive. Now, the holding was just dramatic, very significantly. When this case was evaluated, reviewed by the ECJ last year, I am talking about specifically last June, Edward Snowden revealed all kinds of national security agency data, which included eavesdropping all kinds of other government agencies. That is when European Court of Justice was shocked. Data protection was now a lot more serious matter than ever. And in the course of reviewing this case, the ECJ, no question, was enormously affected by the Snowden revelation NSA files. On May 13th, this year, ECJ said, Mario Costea Gonzalez has a right under the European Data Protection Directive to demand Google to take down the search results relating to him. Of course, search results based upon his name. So that is what we talk about here. Now, there is all kinds of other things we might look at. The impact on freedom of expression. Maybe some people say, oh, I'm sorry, you have a question?
I'm not so sure it's a question. My name is Dario, I'm from Bosnia, Press Council. I'm not so sure that it's a question. I know what is hello to everybody. My name is Dario Novolic and I'm from Press Council of Bosnia and Herzegovina. I know what is a law, of course, that I and all others journalists will respect the law. But I'm really not so sure that I understand all what we talk about now, and I'm not so sure that the Spanish gentleman, he is right. I have just one question for you. Maybe that answer will help me to understand. What if he were a pedophile 30 years ago?
You're talking about a pedophile.
I'm talking about the Spanish guy, which was a judge which had some problem 30 years ago, and now Google and European Union says that we have to forget that.
Yeah.
Just to say one thing, I work like a journalist last 30 years, and I have very old and very good teacher. And he teach me that I have to have notes for everything, whatever I do. In this moment, for these 30 years, I have, let's say, about 200 or 300 notebooks, my notebooks. Mm-hmm. And I know, let's say, all about my professors, because I have some interview with them. That's what I have in my house. Mm-hmm. Google and internet and all other help me, like all other colleagues, journalists, to know a little bit more and to digging on the other ways. They give us directions. But, okay, this case says Mr. Spanish guy has a right to be forgotten.
Yes.
What if his case looked a little bit different 30 years ago? What if he were a pedophile? And now he become minister, or he had to become Minister of Education.
Yeah. I see, at least, that is a good question. But let me, I will definitely get back to you, when
Please.
the floor is open. So let me first finish this. But that's a very good question. I'm sure I will get back to that question when I answer some other questions relating to the very important. But that is what we talk about, freedom of expression. I think people have a right to remember. I am talking what other people did 20 or 30 years ago. That is what we talk about, right to know, as part of freedom of expression. And the freedom of expression, as I said, is a human right. Under Article 19 of the Universal Law of Declaration of Human Rights, and also European Convention on Human Rights, and also all other things. But at least, the DP directive, I say qualified. Qualified means, I think if some information is part of the government record and about important public figures, the information should be part of the freedom of expression, and thus not to be deleted. Of course, the information relating to some kind of news reporting, it should be part of public record. They should be kept. So I think there are some other ways like this: audio-visual files, news archives. Yes, and also press libraries. And look at this, journalistic news reporting should not be too much interfered with by this kind of right to be forgotten. I think that is one way to look at. But important, I'd like to say, the European Court of Justice did not mention Article 11 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights, of Fundamental Freedoms of the European Union. That is just amazing. The European ECJ focused only on the right to forgotten, not talk to anything essentially about the freedom of expression. That is why a lot of people in England and also in the United States, criticized this ruling. And actually yesterday in New York, there was a very important panel of 6 people. They talked about the impact of this case on freedom of expression, specifically what U.S. lawyers need to know about the right to be forgotten. 6 lawyers included the lawyers representing the Google Spain in this case, and also the lawyer who specifically represented Mario Costea Gonzalez. So I think this is a very important case. And also, I forgot to mention this. I think this is, the current issue of the 언론 중재, the official quarterly publication, and the 4 articles specifically address the right to be forgotten. I am talking about 30-page, article on the right to forgotten. Very important. I hope, this kind of article will give you some idea of how the right to be forgotten is not necessarily limited to the European Union. Rather, it is more or less a global issue. Now, this is what we say here. ECJ ruling and the news media. I'd like to finish it real quick. Last night I updated the information. Maybe I think in your conference packet, I'd like you to update page 100, the first paragraph. I might say, you can see some kind of updatedness. But I am talking about Google's report on the removal request as of November 12th, yesterday, essentially. And at the moment, more than 166,000 plus deletion requests were received by Google Inc. And of them, I say at least, I say about, more than 562,000 URL were reviewed. Interestingly, more than 41% of the removal requests were accepted by Google. So it means we talk about a, close to 50% removal requests have given positive, attention. But US, UK news media were targeted for removal requests. The question is, who is requesting the removals of information? That's a very important issue. And some people who commented on a particular article in New York Times or The Guardian or BBC asked for their names to be deleted. That kind of requests were approved by Google. Eventually, the whole article was deleted, even though the person who commented on the article have nothing to do with the major focus of the article. That kind of request were a little bit too much. So that is why American news media and the European news media are now challenging Google's overreaching implementation of the European ECJ ruling. Oops, it's too much. Oh, that's what I'm saying, a brave new world for Google Spain. Right to be forgotten is now shifting the paradigm. I say, whenever we talk about data protection as an information privacy, the EU is now setting the agenda for the entire world, including the United States. That is an extremely important event in the context of right to access to information in the digital era. And right of information is now in a preferred position. The EU decision is now specifically addressing all kinds of freedom of expression versus right to privacy. That is really important to look at. Finally, the fundamental question is who has access to information? We are not necessarily talking about the Google Inc.'s right to process or control the information. What about the access of ordinary people who are using Google to find out about other people? Whenever I meet someone or whenever I want to meet someone, I want to always check or Google him or her for obvious reasons, not necessarily to find something dirty. Rather, try to find out some kind of common topics between the person I am going to meet or someone I met and me. So very important to look at. Now, and most importantly, how to draw the line on the right to be forgotten, and whether regional or global. I think the EU ruling, some people say, can be affecting every country, not necessarily 28 member states of the European Union. There is something we have to think about. I am talking about jurisdictional overreach of the European Union ruling. It means American news media are very much worried or concerned about the impact, whether short or long term, of this ruling. And that is why American lawyers yesterday in New York talked about this case very, very seriously, simply because global American media have no other choice to do business in Europe. And if they are doing in business, they have no other choice to comply with the EU ruling. That is why Google Inc. immediately implemented the May 13 ruling of the right to be forgotten. They came up with some kind of a Google removal request form, and they started accepting in early June. And so that is what is going on. But again, this is something we have to pay attention to. As I said, the ECJ ruling on the right to be forgotten is more or less paradigm shifting. We have to rethink what we thought about our beautiful right to remember through the internet. But that is not the reality. Sometimes we have to accept the reality. We have to embrace the reality. But sometimes we have to rethink through what we think we know what we are doing. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Professor Yom. That was a very interesting talk. I think it raises many interesting questions, and it's something that affects, I think, each and every one of us. Me, as a journalist, I have to admit, we Google people all the time. We try to get perspective, history, whatever. We're always joking. I mean, how did we ever do any research? How were we able to write our stories before there was Google, before there was Naver? Very, very interesting. Now, in the middle of your talk, Mr. Dario Novalic, Yes, you raised a very interesting question about, yes, what if this person asking to be forgotten has done something that is very wrong? I mean, in that case, does he really have a right to be forgotten? Of course, this case with Google in Spain, it's a different case. But yes, Professor Yom, could you address that question?
And the ECJ ruling says something about some kind of a countervailing value of freedom of expression. And of course, even though the ECJ did not elaborate on the countervailing value, but when it comes to some kind of news stories about a public figure, more importantly, an important public official, relating to something he or she did commit years ago, that kind of information relating to the public official should not be subject to the right to be forgotten. But the question is, what about the time frame? 10 years ago, 20 years ago? What about the relevance? What about the inaccuracy? What about accuracy? Also, what about the prejudicial? The word prejudicial is also very vague. It depends upon who is asking, the quality of the information. So public figure or public official exception can be and very likely to be accepted as sort of important counter value against the right to be forgotten, at least. That is what we can read into the ECJ ruling.
Yes.
Of the 166,000 odd cases that were applied, do we know to what trouble Google went in order to verify whether it justified erasing? Because I don't think Google, with all its resources, can really deal with the inundation that it could face. I mean, if I were photographed by some public camera on the street picking my nose, I would like to have it removed, all right? So, I mean, and if Google is, does have the manpower to just say, we're not going to deal with this, Bachau, just delete it. So, I mean, that is a danger of depriving the public of much needed information. Thank you.
I say, when it comes to resource issues, at least Google is capable of handling that kind of removal request, simply because it is the most profitable and the most, best managed company of the whole world. But what about some kind of minor? Some kind of small, sort of a startup internet companies? They are not capable of handling this kind of request. But at the moment, Google is a lot more serious about implementing the ECJ ruling because I think you cannot ignore this kind of ruling. But at least I received an email from Dave Heller, the general counsel of the Media Law Resource Center in New York. He basically said in his email to me last night, there will be some kind of a more sensible approach. I am talking about politicians and the judges, and they say this ECJ ruling of May 13 went a little bit too far. And the ECJ justices did not pay that much attention to all kinds of enormous arguments, issues involved. So some people say when it comes to freedom of expression in connection with the right to be forgotten, maybe the European Court of Human Rights should have been the venue rather than the European Court of Justice, which is primarily focusing on the European Union issues. European Union, as you know, is more or less economic issues rather than freedom of expression and human rights issues. So that is what some opponents might approach. But again, this is sort of ongoing, growing up process or transition process.
Yes, gentleman in the middle. Yes.
My name is Brian Makikit. I'm from South Africa. Prof, you did touch on it slightly, but in your view, what will be, going forward, what will be the test for the right to privacy and freedom of expression?
A right to privacy versus, freedom of expression, and they are more or less in tension, sort of in conflict with each other. It varies, from country to country. Like the United States, the First Amendment is given a preferred position, and there is no such a thing as the right, to privacy. Of course, we talk about the right to privacy under the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. There is a right against intrusion by government authorities. If the government violates someone's right of privacy in the United States, it is a violation of the constitutional right under the Fourth Amendment. But when Google or some private individuals collect information, share the information about you, there is not a constitutional right. So it means automatically, I think sort of institutionally, privacy right is not really as important as freedom of expression. But in Europe, or very much like in South Korea, if I understand the constitutional law of South Korea correctly, the privacy right is on an equal footing with the freedom of expression. So it means one or the other should not be given priorities. So it means it is a never-ending process. But the fundamental question is how to conceptualize the right to be forgotten. I am talking about sort of working definition. I mentioned a right to oblivion, sort of a right to be forgotten, versus right to erasure. Right to erasure as accepted in the state of California. Basically, the right to be a right to erase means if you post something, or if you posted something 10 or 20 years ago, for whatever reason you are wanting to delete the information, that is when the right to be forgotten should be recognized more than any other place. But some other people collect information which is more or less available to everyone, not necessarily created by you. In that case, the right to be forgotten should be more narrowly accepted. So there is some kind of ongoing process. But at least if you ask me about my personal thought, it varies from individual to individual. But at least when we talk about public figures affecting the general welfare of us, in the case, the privacy of the public figures should be less protected, simply because if you get involved in some kind of important public agenda, you are already taking a calculated risk to be more carefully scrutinized by the public, of course, the news media as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, I have a problem again. I hear a lot of answers, but I'm not so sure that I'm satisfied, because you said that's ongoing process, which is true. Everything here is ongoing process, but I just think that the direction where that process moving is not so correct. If it's correct, tell me what to do with library in Alexandria, what to do with the old museum in Egypt, Paris, all archives in Nuremberg, International Red Cross. Do we need to delete some information or what?
I say, at least we talk about this. There is a very important distinction between the original source of the information versus access to the information. So if I use some kind of a library as a sort of example, I say when the right to be forgotten is at issue, it has everything to do with how to control the card catalog of the library versus the book on the shelves. So the book is still on the bookshelves in the library, but the access to the card catalog is more or less limited or controlled. That's what I mean, practical obscurity.
If all of us have a right for information, freedom of information, that means that all of us have a right to better success for any information. If you move catalog from library, if you delete some of information from a visible part of Google, you make me harder my way to find information, which means my freedom to be informed is not the same like before. I just wonder who wished to do that, because we have similar cases. After Second World War, some of war criminals stay alive and stay free several decades. Now we realize that they live normally without any punishment. that's just one of small. I mentioned pedophile at the beginning. Now I mention war crimes.
Yeah.
I don't know what will be happened later, but simply I think that all of us have a right to have an equal right for information.
You know, I say access to
Not to digging more. Just to be simple, if we live in 21st century, if Google gave us that opportunity, if we have correct and true information, give us same right. That's what I ask.
but at least, you know, ECJ does not look at the right to information as a human right, not as the way we want, but at least at the moment, you know, the implementation of the ECJ ruling is up to Google and other search engines. And that is why maybe eventually, you know, I think the right to be forgot might be rebalanced, not the way the ECJ said on May 13th. So that is why we have to look at this kind of issue as part of ongoing dialogue. And there is a lot of things we might say, but more or less, the ECJ 13 judges did not know much about how the internet world is operating. That is more or less revealing.
Oh, so we have lots of questions coming in. Very good. Okay.
I want to go to a different field now. I want to know from you, how do you see the Snowden case towards freedom of expression? In America, normally they put so much weight on this fundamental right, but in this case, they didn't apply it, although there was a lot of public interest towards this information, I would say. So in the end, also in America, they have a kind of system of balance of weighing when national interest is involved, I guess. And they overweigh national interest, in my opinion, in this case, because the public interest is so high towards the Snowden information.
But what do you mean, you know, national interest? Can you
National security
Oh, I see. Okay.
interest.
I see. You know, but at least, you know, I say when ECJ is looking at, you know, the issues involved, ECJ amazingly paid more attention to the economic profits of Google rather than anything else. And when you read the 100 paragraph opinion of ECJ ruling, they are just looking at advertising. You know, whatever Google was, more or less, you know, sort of maximize profits. But when we talk about data protection as a privacy right, fundamentally, it is more or less minimizing information. So maximizing profits is fundamentally antagonistic to you know, the ECJ approach to minimizing the information which is controlled by individuals.
Yeah, but you said that the ECJ is doing a balance of weighing all the time, and in the end, with the Snowden case, America is doing the same towards national security interests. So in the end, also in America, you know that approach, but only in exceptional cases like Snowden. I have the impression.
But at least when it comes to privacy, I think when a privacy interest, it has not much to do with the national security interest.
Yeah, but it's also a balance of weighing between national security interest and freedom of speech in the Snowden case.
Oh, yes.
So also the Americans know about this balance of weighing. In a different context, normally they overweigh freedom of speech, but in this case, they applied also the system of balance of weighing.
Okay.
Okay. Yes, we're running a little over time, so let's take about 5 more minutes. Yeah, I think we have many more questions, but yes.
Yeah. Just a question, again, going back to the Google judgment. You said it were quite vague notions and that the implementation is now up to Google to decide whether to delete the info or to give no access to the information. But isn't that a very dangerous situation that a private company now is deciding whether we have access to information or not? Because it's a private company that is deciding about a public good, which is the right to know of the public.
And I think you know, I make a very good point about the problem relating to the ECJ ruling. The ECJ has more or less dumped the responsibility of sorting out and implementing the ruling on Google. That's right. The private companies are now supposed to read and understand and implement the Google ruling. So then the Google does not want to do that, but that's what the Google is mandated to do. Yeah, I think you and I definitely are not uncomfortable with the way Google is doing. And more seriously, I think Google wants to play safe. They are wanting to make money. If they are asked to delete this or that, and if they are not sure, they usually just what? Err on the side of what? Taking down. Yes, that's right. Over caution, overly cautious. And that is creating all kinds of problems. And Google does not explain why a particular thing is what? Taken down. But when someone is suing Google to do this or that, eventually there will be some kind of a court opinion and interpretation and explanation for the public to understand. But Google, as you probably know, is more secretive than NSA. Nobody knows anything about the algorithm. Oh yes, and my younger son is working, as a computer operations engineer for Intel. I asked my younger son, "Can you tell me anything about Google's algorithm?" He basically said, "Nobody knows much about it." Yes, that's right. Oh, I'm sorry. I could not catch your question.
Very short. Do you know received how to make Coca-Cola? Why you ask algorithm from Google? I don't know.
But I am saying, I think the reason why, because eventually ranking of the search results have everything to do with the algorithm of Google, and that is why if we know, your search results are more or less ranked, top or bottom, sometimes. If you know the way system, you can just, argue.
Yes, if you know how to make Coca-Cola, you can make at your home. That's what I talk about. I mean, I really don't understand why you ask algorithm from Google. You ask them so out of company. Never mind.
Oh, I'm
Yes,
sorry. Okay.
I think because Google is just so overriding. It is in our daily lives. It's in our homes, and it's in our offices. We're very curious about what that company is doing, what they're doing with our information, how perhaps we might all be living in a Google republic one day. I don't know. Do we have more questions from the floor? Yes, I think we'll take one last question.
Thank you. I'm Tarmo Tamerko of the Ombudsman Organization. The media organizations, newspapers, other media organizations are constantly getting more and more requests from the public to delete information. Usually the first point of reference is to the media organization if it's some journalistic material that people want to be deleted from the internet archives. From the media ethical point of view, Professor, what would your suggestion be? Should media organizations make public the names of those people who turn to the media with requests to delete information?
I think that is, something which Google is doing. I am talking about if they are deleting some news stories, I see links to the news stories like in New York Times, The Guardian, BBC. Google is notifying the news media of the removed links. And not surprisingly, the European Commission does not like that kind of notification. And at least, in my opinion, the news media should have a right to know as a matter of transparency. If people are wanting to check the New York Times like I do all the time, if some links to stories which I know were published 1 year ago, 2 years ago, for whatever reason, are no longer available. In that case, the Google should let the New York Times know, and the New York Times let its readers like me know why certain links are no longer available. So very important. But European Union people say this kind of notification is undermining, the sort of a central focus of this kind of ruling, and it means there is something called the Streisand effect. if you sue someone for something else, eventually your case will attract more attention to you. I am talking about the famous actress Barbara Streisand. You know, when she got married, there was a wedding. Some people, you know, started taking pictures and send them out. And Google wanted, Barbara Streisand wanted to assert her right to privacy. And people started looking at what kind of wedding we are talking about. So attracting more attention, more rather than less. So that is reality. But I think eventually this kind of Google's notification will be eventually challenged by EU people.
All right, thank you very much. That was indeed a very hotly discussed topic for this morning. Thank you, Professor Yong. Now we move on to another hot topic, which is speed versus accuracy. Now, can you sacrifice any of those values in the newsroom of today in this digital age? Now, we have Balázs Vér. He is the chairman of the Editors Forum of Hungary. He is also a media consultant. He has worked for many, many years in various positions as a journalist, and he is absolutely qualified to speak with us on this topic. And I am also personally very interested to hear him speak. All right, I hand over the mic to you. Ladies and gentlemen, why don't we welcome him with a big round of applause.
Well, thank you, and thank you indeed for the invitation. It was really worth traveling such a long distance for such a short time for listening to these presentations. And I feel a bit guilty about, you know, interrupting this very interesting and very hot discussion. But well, we are under time pressure, and that's a good illustration to what I will talk about, because my presentation will be about time pressure, because well, probably, as you all know, the most obvious effect for journalists of digitalization is that the speed has increased. The speed is our everyday experience in newsrooms. Speed has always been important, so you probably know those superficial images of journalists in Hollywood movies, like they are always rushing in their old-fashioned hats to catch the deadline, to get the information, as much information as possible until the deadline. And past the deadline, they are drinking their whiskey in the bar. So that's the superficial image of old Hollywood movies of journalists. And right now, it's still true. They are always rushing, but they don't drink their whiskeys after the deadline anymore, because there is no deadline anymore. So the rush remained, the whiskey is gone. So that's a major change in the journalistic life. But there are more important changes than that because of digitalization and because of the speed. And why I think it's very important is because speed and accuracy, speed and double checking, speed and all the traditional tools of quality assurance in journalism, they somehow contradict each other. So the quicker you have to work, the less time you've got to check every information, the less time you've got to dig into information. And the more inaccurate the information is, the more complaints you might get. So it increases the workload of press councils as well. So we have to deal with issues of inaccuracy more and more. And actually, it's also got something to do with the right to be forgotten, because it's not just about the right to forget old sins or sins of your past, but also the right to forget inaccurate information that has been published about you. So let's think of, like you've been suspected to do something wrong, but and it's been published, but at the end it turned out that the suspicion was unfair, but still on top of the Google it's the original information and not the correction. So there's a lot of challenges in terms of speed. So traditionally we had this news cycle. There was a frequency of news. It was a daily frequency. Basically, the daily papers, daily evening news were the main sources of information. And that meant that it was a deadline-driven journalism. So you had a given time frame to get as much information as possible, to cover the issues as detailedly as possible. So you were to achieve the highest possible accuracy in a given time. And that news cycle is gone. So the day-by-day news cycle, the 24 hours news cycle is replaced by, I would say, a minute-by-minute coverage of the news. This way. So that time, speed meant timely advantage. Exclusivity of information, exclusivity of news was something different than these days. One of the best things in the internet is that the news spread very quickly. It multiplies very quickly. But it also means that exclusive information multiplies very quickly, so in minutes, which means that exclusivity as such is gone. So it's talking in media business terms, it's not worth the investment anymore to prepare exclusive news because it will be in a minute at your computer, copying, pasting, and well, maybe a generalist link to your original piece. And in the age of the daily news cycle, accuracy was easier to achieve. Accuracy was more important. As in an exclusive story, you had more time to prepare it. You remember the term breaking news was much more rarely used those times. So we had breaking news like a few times a year. Now we have breaking news every day, almost every day. So it's like almost every minute. And so what was breaking news in the old times? It's the everyday practice for journalists these days. So we've got a deadline every minute, and I think that we had to, or we should somehow differentiate between this minute-by-minute type of journalism and the rest, the more detailed, accurate kind of journalism. And I will suggest like 2 or 3 metaphors for that. What I think is that we have to do it transparently, so differentiate transparently between the so-called live or instant journalism, acknowledging that we can't achieve the accuracy that we expected in the old days from journalism in these genres, and that transparency would provide the audience the information that it might not be as accurate as you would expect. And later, when there is time for analyze, double check the information, that should be labeled another genre. So, no, the other way. Yeah, so it's just an example. It's just, some kind of a daily breaking news. I can't really recall what was that already, but you can see that it was the day's Ebola story when I prepared this presentation, and there was like 200-something stories in 10 minutes from the same issue, just as an illustration of the pressure. So the speed obviously undermines accuracy. And inaccurate reporting undermines the public knowledge. And what I think the main concern is that the more important the story, the more complicated it is. And the more important the story, the more time you need to cover it. So the most important stories get the least attention these days. So that's what we have to address somehow. So I told you I suggest a few metaphors, a few parallels for how we should differentiate between the instant journalism, live journalism, and the rest, the kind of normal way of journalism. And one metaphor is the football coverage. So as you know, if you probably are familiar with, at least at some extent, with football or soccer. That's just a short. That's just a.
В контратаку німецький
It's the World Cup final.
Удар!
Well, but you know how a football commentary looks like. So football commentators are commentating.
І м'яч у воротах! Як же зараз ніхто не накрив Томаса Мюллера?
So whatever, the football commentators are commentating the match live, and so they don't have time to analyze. They just see what we see, and they are shouting.
Як можна ось так залишати нападника в штрафному майданчику, без опіки? Скільки бразильців, порахуйте? 5, 6 в штрафному, начебто там накрили Клоза, накрили Хеведеса. І ось 4 гравці збірної Бразилії абсолютно нікого не криють. Стоять.
Well, that was enough of this. Enough of this. Thank you. But so, a football commentator, when they commentate live, they don't have time to analyze. They don't have time to control. So if someone falls inside the penalty area, they shout penalty, but maybe it wasn't penalty. But after the replay, they might say that, well, it looks like it wasn't a penalty. Sorry, I was mistaken. Or they shout red card if if the national team is playing, they are also biased, and we accept that biasness in sports, in live commentary. But even if they are not biased, as they don't have time, they're commentating live. They are like one of us. They are just a spectator who are looking at the match from a bit closer than us. And that's very similar to what live journalism is. They are, sitting in they are at a parliament seating or at a tribunal, or when there is breaking news, and they are sharing rumors, half-baked information, sometimes opinions. So they are mixing opinion with or personal observations with fact. Sometimes they get emotional under the pressure of the currency of the event. For example, when the event itself is emotional, and breaking news are sometimes emotional when it's a catastrophe, when it's tragical. I'm sure you had some of that at the tragic ship catastrophe here in Korea a few months ago. I've heard it was the sentence for the captain came just yesterday, as I've heard that. But probably at the day when the catastrophe happened, you didn't know as much about who was to blame as yesterday when the tribunal wrote the sentence. But someone was to blame in the press already, because it's a very emotional, very tragic event. And many breaking news events are like that. So in football coverage, we accept that the reporters are inaccurate at first. And then after the replay, they are a bit more accurate. And then there are programs in the evening or the next day when experts analyze the aftermath of the game. But then inaccuracy was least acceptable, because they have all the data, they have all the computer software to analyze the match. But it's the tradition that's very transparent that a live commentator of football is not supposed to be as accurate. So there's our expectations are different than from the from an expert who analyzes the match after that. So yes, so a reporter can get under the atmosphere of the current events, and he might become emotional. He's under the pressure of the audience as well. And another metaphor, it's from healthcare. It's the emergency room. So at the emergency room, the rules are also different and like at a normal hospital event. So if there is an emergency, we are not expecting the doctors to spend time for consulting with each other. They need to act fast, and they need to rescue lives as fast as they can. So fast is better than the best. So they need to seek an optimum between the fast and the best solution, because they are working under high pressure. Their chance to misdo, their chance to make mistakes is much higher than in normal healthcare. And we also accept it because these are the circumstances. We know this is how an emergency room works. This is also a bit similar to the live coverage or instant coverage of events. But I could also mention a third suggestion. It's a very different one. Think of fast food and slow food. So what are your expectations from fast food? The main expectation that it be fast and it be food, and that's all. So you wouldn't expect that it would be the best food of your life. It's just something to get away your hunger with. But if you are going to a nice high-end restaurant, you're not expecting it to be fast. You're expecting it to be the best. So we have to manage the perception, manage the expectations between these genres. Whatever we do, we can't. The need for speed in journalism won't go away. So we might cry over spilled milk in these terms, but we won't get back the old slow news cycles, from our perception in the present. That time it wasn't considered to be slow, but so what I think is that we have to manage the expectations, and we have to be very transparent about that. There is no way we can keep the old standards of accuracy in the instant journalism, which doesn't mean that we have to give up the need for accuracy, but we have to acknowledge that in the given time, not the old standards of accuracy are not achievable. But still, we've got other genres. So it's like the live commentary of football and the analysis aftermath. So in the live events, in the covering current events, live events, we have to acknowledge that we won't be that accurate, and we have to let the public know transparently that it's covered live. Don't expect that much accuracy. But when we are not covering something live, when we are analyzing the event afterwards, it has to be as accurate again as possible. The highest possible standards of accuracy need to be achieved, because one of the main concerns are that if we decrease our expectations for accuracy on the live event, it might decrease the expectations of accuracy in the not live standard pace coverage. But we shouldn't. So we have to at least keep our old standards in the standard pace journalism, when we are not covering things live. So we need to differentiate between these instant journalism from the rest and create dedicated ethical rules for the live and for the not live type of journalism and make it transparent. That's why I kind of suggest to use some kind of a standard logo or brand for these instant or live journalism, because it would instantly tell the people that this is live, this is instant, don't accept that much accuracy. So, and probably if we can achieve that, if we can do that, they will be able to differentiate as well, and they will accept that this is the transparent rule, like in football. But at the end, we shouldn't lower our expectations to the ethical demands, to the ethical standards of journalism, just on this instant coverage, which will remain with us and probably will gain even more ground in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Weir. It's interesting in the sense that maybe the audience will be forgiving, but our bosses are not so forgiving in the newsroom. So I hope you can talk to our editors, tell them, this is live. Please be a little bit more lenient. But anyway, yes, indeed. Just 4 months ago, I worked for another affiliate inside the Chungang Media Group, JTBC, which is the television arm of the group. It is about 3 years old, very young, but making very, very new programs, and we have a different approach to news. And obviously, we have live new programs during the day, during which journalists are free to add commentary, perspective, whatever. But even now, we are expected to be absolutely accurate, which is posing a major pressure factor for all of us working in the industry. And as Balázs said, there are no deadlines in a life in journalism now. Every minute, every second is a deadline. In fact, I don't know if you've noticed, but I'm checking my phone constantly because we get breaking news feeds all the time, and Korea being one of the hottest places for breaking news. This is a very, very dynamic country. We have breaking news all the time, and so I'm in the habit of checking on what's coming in all the time. So it's a completely different world that we live in now. I mean, I think we all recognize that. I'm sure we have more questions for Balázs from the floor, but Professor Yom has a question that he would like to pose. No? Okay, all right. Yes, he wants to save his question for the end. As viewers, as consumers of news, what do you think? What are your expectations? Do you still have a very, very high expectation when it comes to accuracy, even when it's live? Do you agree with Balázs's view that, you should accept that this is a live situation? Yes, do you have a question?
I expect we should get a correct and best accurate news. Rather than my expectation is that it is public right to know the accurate, correct, credible information rather than instantaneous information. So when we will compromise with respect to speed, where will be the ethical journalism? So public right to know, I think, is a paramount consideration than the prompt information. How you compare right to know with the speed, right to know any report, any coverage, irrespective of the ethical point of view or not.
Well, I think it's tricky because it's not so much the audience where the pressure comes from in terms of speed. It's much more the publishers actually, and much more the newsrooms themselves, because speed and the timestamp on news, it's a very easy way to compare or to compete with your competitors. So it became the main benchmark of a newsroom. So that's where you at the first instance compete with your competitors. I think that the audience would have a bit more time to wait. It comes from our publishers, from our editors, and I'm not sure if your editors would say that, okay, give it some more time, just be accurate. They would say that, let's get it out as soon as possible, and we'll check it later.
They want everything. They want speed and accuracy. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, please go ahead. We'll get the mic to you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, Paulus, thank you very much for the report. It's really a very controversial topic. And it seems to me that if the media were to label some of the stories as, you can expect mistakes here, that would undermine the credibility of the news media overall. Because I think a sensible reader would understand anyway that when it's live coverage of a football match, or when it's live coverage online, for instance, of a sudden big political demonstration, at the first line says, well, the square hasn't filled up at all. Instead of expected thousands of people, we can see only 200 people. And then 10 minutes later, the text is changed. The square has filled up. We now have 10,000 demonstrators together already. So it's clear that the readers wouldn't mind this, you changing the text. But of course, there must be a timestamp all the time that you have changed the story. But there was an interesting discussion recently, an international discussion in Europe, in a few countries got together, and some people said that actually online journalists and online media should be striving even for more accuracy than the traditional print media. Because, yes, the newspapers have a reputation for accuracy and so on, but their exposure to the public is becoming smaller. Fewer people read newspapers, regular newspapers. More and more people turn online for brief news items, which means that we should be actually fundamentally changing the understanding that what we produce online should be even more correct, because it has a much bigger impact and could change the lives of people and the fates of people and so on. But the question, Paulus, to the about your presentation is, and if you would be supporting the idea that it's a good idea to label stories, this is live or whatever, this is an ongoing story, expect mistakes, and how do you draw the line between this is like a story that can contain mistakes, and that's a story which you should never expect any mistake? How do you draw the line there? Thank you.
Well, it's like when the story is until it's happening, it's probably things can change in the pace of events. But I don't want to be mistaken. I'm not suggesting that we should write it always there, like objects in the mirror might well, how does it go in the rear windows of the cars, whatever. So there shouldn't be a disclaimer always there that take care, these texts can contain mistakes. It's just about formatting, typography, like what you said, when it's a minute-by-minute account of the events with timestamps. It's already a format that tells people that it's a live coverage, things are still changing, we are covering it live, so they understand. That's a transparent way of covering events live. But not every news provider does that. So sometimes they are doing it in the regular format and kind of rephrasing the sentences parallelly with why the events are happening. But this minute-by-minute type, it's already a transparent way of doing things. The problem is that many times when the event is over, there is then there is no more accurate wrap-up. What I'm using again the football metaphor, what I would call a replay, when everything is seen more detailedly. When you cover something live, things, the importance of things, the importance of certain moments of the event are not so clear as they happen. But at the end, you can already analyze what was an important momentum and what wasn't. So you need to have a replay after that, and that has to be transparent. That okay, it's after the event, it's already a replay. We've checked it already. We had some time to analyze things. So these genres need to be differentiated, I guess. But I would never suggest that we should allow inaccuracy in kind of in-depth kind of genres, in-depth stories.
All right. Yes, gentleman in the back.
네, 저는 한국 신문에서 일하고 있는 기자입니다. 신속성과 정확성에
Just a
대해서.
second, I need to.
네, 잠시만요.
Yeah, thank you.
네.
예,
질문해
저는
주세요.
한국 신문에서 일하면서 항상 신속성과 정확성이라고 하는 두 가지 압력을 함께 받고 있는 기자입니다. 지금 바이어 회장님께서 말씀하신 발표 내용을 염규 교수님의 발표 내용과 연결시켜서 저는 질문을 드리고자 하고 두 분께서 각각 답변을 해주셨으면 좋겠습니다. 지금 바이어 회장께서 말씀하신 것은 인스턴트 뉴스 저널리즘이 결국은 정확하지 못하기 때문에 부정확한 보도가 될 수밖에 없는데 지금 디지털 시대의 문제는 그 부정확한 보도가 영원히 남아 있고 그것이 손쉽게 검색된다라고 하는 문제입니다. 그것이 간단한 오자나 실수일 경우에는 큰 문제가 되지 않지만 아동 성폭행범의 이름을 잘못 다른 엉뚱한 사람을 지명해서 쓴 커다란 오보일이라고 생각을 할 때 그런 경우에 과연 우리는 이런 기사에 대해서 과거로 소급해서 삭제해달라는 요청, 잊혀질 권리를 주장할 수 있는가? 즉 그 한 번 보도된 기사가 공적인 영역에 들어왔기 때문에 이것은 하나의 공식적인 기록으로 우리가 저널리즘의 기록으로 보존해야 된다라고 하는 저널리즘적 고유의 가치를 계속 유지할 것인가? 아니면 이렇게 명확한 피해를 일으키는 기사에 대해서는 거기에 대해서 우리가 과거를 소급해 가지고 영 교수님께서 말씀하신 그런 practical obscurity 같은 것들을 적용할 것인가? 과거 데이터를 우리가 소급해서 삭제하고 수정할 권리를 온라인에서 부여할 것인가? 이것에 대해서 두 분 발표자님께서 각각 답변해 주시면 고맙겠습니다.
Right. Would you like to answer first? Okay.
Yes, thank you. I think that's a very important question, and that's why I think that the right to be forgotten is also a very important issue. But it's not just about deleting items from the Google search list. That's why the way we do it, the way our ethical guidelines say it, in online publications, a correction should not just be published separately in kind of the next issue as the traditional pattern went, but the original article has to be modified, not in its original text, but it has to, a disclaimer has to be put on that there was a correction published in regards of this article in terms of that and that fact, and click here to look at that correction. So there's a correction published separately, and it is linked to the original article. So whatever comes first in Google, you might get the correct information at the end.
Thank you. Professor Yom, what do you think?
Speed and accuracy is definitely among the most important elements of news reporting. The fundamental question is whether the news media are willing to correct, what they know or what they are suspected, to be knowing of the inaccuracy. I think I happened to read this article while flying to Seoul, 4 days ago from the United States. Matthew Leach, he is a vice president and assistant general counsel of the New York Daily News. He is talking about all kind of takedown request issues. As assistant general counsel of the New York Daily News, he said his newspaper doesn't have any problem with accepting the request for correction, especially the correction is proved instead of just alleged. And so this is a very important way to look at. But the question is, how do you know the story, which was published many years ago, was incorrect now? Why there was no silence for many years after the story was published? Sometimes that kind of thing is not easy to handle. And also the news reporters who originally published, the editors who were directly involved in managing the original stories are now not easily available or locatable. In that case, it is raising a lot of questions, but at least the benchmarking approach for this particular news media attorney said, if the story is found to be inaccurate, they are eager to comply with that kind of request. And this comment is reminding me of Steve Brill. He's a very influential media person and an attorney by training. He was the publisher of a now defunct publication, Legal Affairs. It was part of the publication of Yale Law School. In one of his articles, he published in Legal Affairs probably more than a dozen years ago, he proposed very much like what the press arbitration is doing. If a story is challenged to be inaccurate, American news media should go out of their way to re-examine the story's truth or accuracy and willing to correct and update the information. There is one way to exercise freedom of the press and, more importantly, responsibility of the press. As I said, in 1946, in the case of Pennycamper versus Florida, Justice Felix Frankfurt, one of the most influential Supreme Court justices in the United States, he said in a concurring opinion that under the First Amendment, freedom of the press is guaranteed more or less absolute, but it is not so absolute as some people argue. Whenever we talk about freedom of the press, it cannot be only freedom. It is responsibility. When the framers of the U.S. Constitution framed the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in 1791, the framers basically assumed that they don't have to, put responsibility to the press, because freedom of the press is already referring to responsibility of the press, and that kind of a thoughtful, concurring opinion should be part of our understanding, our means everyone, our understanding of freedom of the press in the United States. Of course, America is exceptional in its commitment to a free press, but they are challenged to be less free when it comes to irresponsible freedom of the press.
May I add something? There are, as I said, that also in our times, as information spreads much faster, also inaccurate information spreads much faster. So if we make a small mistake or a big mistake in a live coverage and correct it 10 minutes later in that terms of 10 minutes, it might be reshared, retweeted everywhere, and we can't correct it everywhere already. But many times fake information is more engaging than correct information. So there's a very good example that the Guardian analyzed a few years ago. You remember the London riots, where for a few days there be riots in London, and one of the most funny fake information that went viral all through the internet was that the rioters set the animals from the zoo free, from the London Zoo free. And it was everywhere because it's very engaging. It's a very good story that, you know, all these wild beasts are wandering the streets of London, but it was totally fake.
It's a great story.
Yeah, and they analyzed on an infographic how it spread from one Twitter account with many followers. So it appeared somewhere. It was corrected almost right away, but someone on Twitter with many followers retweeted it, and it was all over the place. So it took days to correct it everywhere. Like the people learned that okay, it was just fun. It wasn't true, and there were many cases like that through that riots that came out from this Guardian aftermath analysis, but. And that was classic breaking news, of course. I mean the riots, not the zoo thing, which is a fake. But it might happen every day. So that's why these corrections and right to be forgotten, at least in terms of inaccurate information, is very important.
All right. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for addressing this issue with your perspectives and insights. Professor Yom, you said you wanted to make some closing remarks?
Not necessarily closing remarks, but a few words of thanks. You know, I just want to say thank you to our first-class moderator, An Cha-ki, you know, for making sure everybody is on track. So she did marvelously, you know, you chaired the session with such finesse. So she deserves our big round of applause.
Oh, thank you.
And also my thanks to Press Arbitration Commission Chair Yong-Sung Park for elevating the Press Arbitration Commission to a new level of excellence as a very important press law organization, not only in the United States, but also abroad, and also to the amazingly committed Press Arbitration Commission staff, especially Chief Operations Officer, Ms. Shim Young-shin. Now, if you don't mind, Mr. Shim, will you rise and to be recognized? And she does this also. Thank you so much. And finally, but you know, as equally important to you, the audience, you took time out of your busy schedule to come all the way from all kinds of different places to listen to my presentation, and also to my friend from Hungary. And this is an amazing experience for me, not only as an American media law scholar, but also Korean American. And I have seen the extraordinary transformation of my native countries, what progress, not only economically, but more importantly, politically. And this is something I always enjoy talking about. The United States should be very proud of South Korea. And at least, Stanford law professor Lawrence Friedman said, several years ago, there are 3 countries which were an amazing case of democracy exported by the United States. And West Germany, Japan, and South Korea. And no question, everybody can economically succeed, every country. But not every country can see politically. And that's what I can say. I am returning home to the United States day after tomorrow with a lot of fond memories of the hospitality of you, the audience, as well as Press Arbitration Commission members. Many, many thanks. Let's stay in touch.
Right. Okay. I think that about wraps up this session, this final session of this very well-organized conference. Thank you once again for making this session so lively with your very thoughtful questions. And I'd also like to thank Professor Yeom-Gyu Ho and Balazs Beyer, Mr. Balazs Beyer, for participating in this session. I think we're all about ready for lunch, so why don't we head over then, okay? Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, wait a moment. Thank you all very much. Our Secretary General, Mr. Kwon Woo-dong, also will make an ending statement.
네, 안녕하십니까. 언론중재위원회 사무총장 권우동입니다. 여러분들의 어떤 적극적인 참여와 협조로 컨퍼런스가 성공적으로 잘 진행된 것 같습니다. 진심으로 감사를 드립니다. 지난 이틀간 우리는 세계 각국의 언론 보도 정점과 언론 피해 구제제도 또 인터넷 미디어 시대에 새롭게 나타난 여러 가지 이슈들에 대해서 다양한 주제 발표와 의견 교환이 있었습니다. 특별히 발제와 사회를 맡아주신 분들 그리고 멀리 세계 각국에서 참석해 주신 여러분들께 깊은 감사의 말씀을 드립니다. 이번 컨퍼런스에서 논의된 이러한 그 논의들이 세계 각국의 언론 현황과 또 뉴미디어에 대한 이해를 높이는 계기가 되었으면 하는 바람을 갖습니다. 해외 참석자 여러분들을 위해서 저희 위원회가 준비한 한국문화 투어가 오후부터 진행이 됩니다. 해외 참석자 여러분들께 좋은 시간과 경험이 되기를 기대합니다. 컨퍼런스에 적극 참여해 주신 모든 분들께 다시 한번 깊은 감사의 마음을 전하면서 이상으로 2014년도 저희 위원회가 준비한 국제 컨퍼런스 일정을 모두 종료하도록 하겠습니다. 감사합니다. Thank you everyone.